You're watching Neon Gods. In this episode, part 1 of 2 on the Soul Cages album, we will look at how this album broke Sting's writer's block, how the death of his parents is linked with the decline of his hometown, and we'll start to consider how we deal with death in our religious rituals. How does Sting weave folktales, biblical stories, and Jungian archetypes all together in one album? Find out on this episode of Sting, Religion, and the Meaning of Life. Okay, in the next video, we're going to focus on the song All This Time exclusively, but I think it makes more sense to talk about the whole context of the Soul Cages album first. So we're doing a Soul Cages part 1 on the whole album, and then a Soul Cages part 2 focused only on All This Time. We've touched on this album briefly already in past episodes, especially when we looked at Sting's upbringing in Wallsend, but we'll look at the bigger picture of this album now. So the Soul Cages comes out in 1991, but let's just back up a bit. His mother dies of cancer in 1986 while he is recording the Nothing Like the Sun album, which comes out the next year in 1987. He knew his mother was dying when he recorded it, and you'll remember in episode 1 when we talked about Sting's interest in Mary and the feminine image of God, and that Sting said that this whole album ended up being about his attempt to integrate his feminine aspects as his mother was dying. Now remember that Sting is influenced by Carl Jung, right? So there's the whole anima animus or male and female aspects thing here, but we'll do a whole video on Sting and Jung later in the series. Okay, so in 1987, a year after his mother dies, Sting's father also dies of cancer, and this sends him into somewhat of a depression, and he also develops writer's block. So notice it's almost 4 years until the Soul Cages comes out. Now, we also examined how Sting had a challenging relationship with his father, who was not very expressive. Sting tells the story of how when his father was on his deathbed, he was holding his hands and suddenly realized for the first time that they had the exact same hands.
And I hadn't really noticed that before until he was on his deathbed, and I mentioned this to him. And then he said to me, well, you used your hands better than I did. My dad was a milkman. And I realized that that was probably the first compliment he'd ever paid me. And that was kind of devastating to me.
So the Soul Cages album, we can safely say, is largely inspired by the death of his father, but you'll hear Sting say in interviews that in a way it's about the death of both of his parents, and that is also wrapped up in the decline and death of his hometown, and specifically the shipbuilding industry in northern England and the closing of the shipyard in his hometown of Wallsend. Be sure to watch episode 1 of this series if you haven't already, because that goes over his upbringing. So there's a kind of connection made between the death of the father and the death of the industry that he once worked in. Now, Sting's father left his job at the shipyard when he bought the local dairy and became the milkman, but many of Sting's male elders still worked in the shipyard or were involved in shipping in general, and that goes back many generations. So Sting is processing this whole family and community history on this album as he's working through the death of his parents and specifically his father. And yes, the religious aspects of dealing with death is also a theme on the album, and mostly in All This Time. You know, it's worth mentioning here, especially for our younger viewers, that in the past, albums often had a coherent theme or a narrative to them. We used to talk about a concept album back in the day, for example. Good albums were like a book almost, where each song was like a different chapter, and there might be a melodic or thematic thread that you could hear running through the whole album. Some songs might be seamlessly connected to indicate continuity of theme and so on. You could still have hit songs from albums that function on their own, especially like on the radio. But if you really wanted to understand them, you'd have to put them in the context of the album to really get what the artist was doing. And that is definitely the case for All This Time and the Soul Cages album. You know, when I was a kid, you'd get a cassette tape or a CD and you'd sit in your room and listen to the whole album from start to finish. And you'd open the CD insert and read the lyrics, and you'd look at the artwork. And I would read all the details of who played the instruments and produced the album. And like many other kids and teenagers at that time, I would just sit there for an hour and just try to figure out what the album was all about. And there were no devices or text messages coming in, and you couldn't Google things about the album or the artist. You would just sit there and listen to the music and let your mind wander. What a glorious time it was.
I have to go back.
Anyway, I think there's a lot to discuss in a future video about how streaming has made it easier to isolate the song from its larger meaning. And people just make playlists now instead of buying and listening to the whole album, and I'm just as guilty. But I wonder how much these changes have reshaped songwriting itself. I feel like it has made it harder for artists to make actual albums as opposed to standalone hits designed just for good streaming numbers. And I wonder what effect that loss has on our ability to really listen to music and derive meaning from the music that we listen to. Of course, there are exceptions and there are still good albums today, but I think it's hard for younger people to understand today how much listening to music in the past was about listening to the whole album. But that's a video for another day on this channel. So my suggestion is to queue up the Soul Cages album on whatever format or streaming service you have available, and to listen to this as a whole album after you watch this video, or maybe hit play on it now while you watch. Like I said, we'll focus on all this time and the death rituals of the church in the next video, but maybe listen to the whole album before you watch the next video so you can get a sense of the whole thing. If you do that, I would love to see your comments on what you get out of this experience and what exactly jumps out at you compared to what I'm saying. Okay, so the Soul Cages album starts with Northumberland Pipes, played by the great Catherine Tickell, which reflects that Celtic Northumberland folk music tradition.
For Sting, obviously being from the Northeast, it does come to his mind. And I think particularly with that Soul Cages album, which was the first one that I was on, that was at a point where he was very much thinking about his dad and about that Northeast part of him.
Full circle now with the last ship stuff.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
You heard that album?
No.
Changed my life.
Really?
What,
honestly.
The Last Ship?
Soul Cages. I loved
Soul
it.
Cages.
Yeah. I think anybody who would have in the past debated Sting's loving of the region, all debated in that album, if you listen closely to the lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's really, really interesting, every track.
Like, put that Sting album on. And we listened to it in its entirety, the Soul Cages, and it was like, wow, that's really good. And I'd forgotten how much I love it.
I heard that album. A friend of mine was a session drummer, Irish guy. I lived with him for a while in Glasgow. He gave me that album when I was in my early 20s. And it was my version of you living away from the Northeast, because I was in Glasgow, feeling a bit estranged, and I wasn't with my family. I got this album, and it just, all of my sort of identity flags went up.
Yes.
And I thought, this is incredible. This is
this
is the Northeast.
Opened.
I could feel it. I could sense it. I could hear it. It's really, really powerful.
Yeah.
I'm going to play it later on. Okay. In the
and
interval.
it also has a little bit of, he's struggling with that pull towards it and the need to leave it. It's all in there.
That's what I think is
really
interesting
important.
about it, because I think it's if I was him, and any criticism you get, as artists, you do, don't you, about whether you're leaning enough about being from the Northeast or whether you're not. I think you hear that whole debate in that album. If you listen closely, his relationship with his dad, his wanting to get away from it.
Yeah.
And you can, it's just really cool.
This leads us right into the first song called Island of Souls. So the opening lyric of the whole album is Billy was born within sight of the shipyard. And Sting once said that this single line is what snapped him out of his writer's block. And he realized that he needed to write about his hometown to begin to process the death of his father, or both of his parents. So this opening song, Island of Souls, tells the story of a boy named Billy who watches his father die over the course of a couple weeks after an industrial accident at the shipyard. And the chorus, if we can call it that, shifts not only in the rhythm, but it shifts from the details of what's happening to Billy's father in the verses into Billy's dream of escaping with his father in the chorus. And the lyrics at the end give us the punchline of this dream and the title of the song itself. And the lyrics are, that night he dreamed of the ship in the world. It would carry his father and he To a place they could never be found, to a place far away from this town, a Newcastle ship without coals, they would sail to the island of souls. And the song ends with what sounds like a sea shanty and gives you the sense of a ship swaying back and forth, and you can even hear industrial ship noises as the song fades out back into the Northumberland pipes. And then it's a quick, seamless transition into the second track, All This Time. And now we shift into the first person as well. So Island of Souls was talking about Billy, but All This Time starts with, I looked out across the river today. So now Billy, from his own point of view, is describing the priests coming to do the last rites as his father is dying. And Sting has said in interviews that he is basically Billy, not literally in the storyline of the song because Sting's father didn't die from an accident, but Billy is basically Sting and a composite of all the boys who grew up in Wallsend thinking that working in the shipyard would be their fate too. Now, like all concept albums, it's not that every song perfectly fits into the dominant theme, but most of them do fit into this framework of death and mourning. There's a paternal theme, whether we're talking about his literal father or maybe father as in priest. And it's often centered around the sea and ships and these sorts of nautical themes. And of course, there's a lot of religious imagery on this album, and I would emphasize criticism of the church more so than in his other albums. So Island of Souls is the accident and the dying process. All This Time is the last rites and then the funeral. And then by track 3, it shifts away from this narrative to a song called Mad About You. This story is based on the second book of Samuel from the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, and it's about King David's obsession with Bathsheba. It's one of Sting's many songs about longing and complicated love triangles. I wonder if for him it fit the album in the sense that it's linked to the tumultuous relationship Sting's parents had and maybe his mother's affair, but I'm just speculating there. Nonetheless, an interesting biblical motif going on in this song. Track 4 is Jeremiah Blues Part 1. Now, I don't get the Part 1 reference because there is no Part 2. I think he hinted once that there was a Part 2, but he never released it. Sting once explained that because of the environmental activism he was getting into in the 1980s, especially around the burning of the rainforests, that he had been called a Jeremiah by critics. Now, Jeremiah is a prophet in the Hebrew Bible, lived in the 6th century BCE, and was known for his very pessimistic view and moral criticism and his warning of the impending collapse of society. Of course, he turned out to be right, but nonetheless, people will call someone a Jeremiah if they have a doom and gloom view of where society is heading. So the song plays on this accusation against him and is meant as a kind of ironic twist on this criticism. It's in part about rich people partying while the world burns. There's a couple digs at the Catholic hierarchy. At one point he sings a cardinal's wife was jailed. And then later he sings a pope claimed he'd been wrong in the past. This was a big surprise. I won't go much deeper than that other than to say that it's one of the many times where Sting will take some shots at the church leadership. And perhaps it fits in with the album, too, in the sense of economic collapse of his hometown. By the way, awesome guitar work on this track by Dominic Miller. Let me know in the comments if you have any more insights on this song, because I do think there's a lot going on there. Track 5 is called Why Should I Cry For You? This is a beautiful and heartbreaking song. This is all about his father and mourning his death, built around the metaphor of a ship on the ocean. Dark angels follow me over a godless sea, mountains of endless falling for all my days remaining. Sting is still deep in mourning on this song, and then towards the end he asks, what would it mean to say I loved you in my fashion? So next we have a classical guitar instrumental sort of interlude on the album called St. Agnes and the Burning Train. There is an actual St. Agnes, but the title likely refers to Sting's grandmother Agnes, who we talked about in episode 1, who was probably the most devout of Sting's Catholic relatives. So is he canonizing her in this title? I'm not really sure. And apparently there was a fire on the train when she was traveling to visit him one time. So if anybody knows any more details than that, make sure you leave them in the comments. Okay, then track 7, The Wild Wild Sea. Remember that the sea is often linked to the unconscious in Jungian thought. And Sting did say in an interview around this time that he had seen a Jungian analyst for a while. So he says in the lyrics book that this song is based on some dream fragments from, as he puts it, a night of fitful sleep. And he saw these images of being on a ship in stormy water. Towards the end of the song, as a storm is brewing and he's presumably losing control, he notices a sailor at the wheel steering the ship into the wind, which is what you're supposed to do in a storm, right? Because you don't want the waves to hit the side of the boat. So I sort of interpret it as heading consciously into the turmoil. We might read it as maybe facing the reality of death head on. This is definitely a big theme in Sting's music. And then in the climax of the song, after the sailor has taken the wheel, Sting sings, "For the ship had turned into the wind against the storm to brace, and underneath the sailor's hat, I saw my father's face."
Underneath the sailor's hat, I saw my father's face.
So is Sting's father saving him in the dream, or maybe Sting is watching his father face his own death? That's definitely open to interpretations. Then we come to the title track, the penultimate song, The Soul Cages. This is more of a rock feel with electric guitars, and yet it still has a folk feeling to it. And you can even hear Sting's Geordie accent coming out, I think, in this one at times. So he says in his lyrics book that it's based on a British folktale that he was told as a kid. It looks like it's actually Irish in origin, but that makes sense that it would spread to a place like Newcastle. And it's possibly even influenced by an older German folktale, but you can find it in an 1821 book by Thomas Crofton Croker called Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland. So basically, it's a story of a male mermaid who lives under the sea and for some strange reason has the souls of dead sailors trapped in lobster cages, or pots in another version. And a young man named Jack, who is a fisherman, meets with him and is shocked to find these souls trapped down there. Basically, the only way he can free them is to trick the mermaid into getting drunk and passing out so Jack can release them. And so he eventually does this successfully, and the souls float to the surface and are finally free. So Sting had this image of trapped souls under the ocean from knowing the story as a kid. And the Soul Cages, which is literally the name of the folktale, has a kind of double meaning for Sting's album because Sting himself is trapped in a cage with his suffering. Or maybe Sting's father's soul is trapped in a cage and he needs someone to help free him. Also notice that he makes an adaptation to the traditional story when he says, "These are the souls of the broken factories, the subject slaves of the broken crown, the dead accounting of old guilty promises. These are the souls of the broken town." So again, the album links his father's death with the end of an era in Wallsend and Newcastle and the shipbuilding industry. And is the dead accounting of old guilty promises a reference to Thatcher era economic theory perhaps, which is a theme he has brought up in other songs like We Work the Black Seam Together? I'm not sure, but I think he's trying to convey the image that there are lots of souls from his hometown trapped in the soul cages still. But the most dramatic part of the song comes in the final verse, where even though he stays in the same basic structure and rhythm of the song, he returns to the final verse of The Island of Souls, the first song on the album. And he repeats the same lyric that ended the opening song of the album. A Newcastle ship without coals, they would sail to the Island of Souls. So again, this is a proper album that has connecting threads and themes that come back. So we've gone back now to the character of Billy as we approach the end of the album. And of course, Billy is Sting, basically. And perhaps Billy has freed his father's soul, just like Jack freed the souls of the dead sailors. In his memoir, Sting writes, "Go to sea, my father would always tell me, but I knew he was really speaking to himself as a younger man and ruining his landlocked captivity." Maybe when Sting's father said, "You used your hands better than I did," he was acknowledging that Sting's escape from the town had brought him some kind of deathbed peace or sense of redemption. And finally, we have the last song, "When the Angels Fall." First of all, the ethereal mood of the song sets the tone. Once again, Dominic Miller's glassy guitar sound really makes this song and gives it this otherworldly feeling, which certainly fits the theme. This isn't a song that Sting generally plays live because it's not exactly an upbeat crowd pleaser, but I did get to hear him sing it once at a sound check, and he's known for playing his deep cuts to the small crowds at sound checks, probably just to breathe new life into his lesser known songs. If nothing else, just listen to Dominic Miller's guitar work here, which is just so good. I actually just realized in this research that he has a co-writing credit on this song. I don't want to get too specific with my interpretation of the song, but a general way to think about it would be that angels are of the spirit realm, and they're pure, they live in a sacred dimension, they're set apart from the profane world. And so if they fall, sort of like how Satan falls, they have become corrupted by evil and so on. Sting seems to be linking the concept of angels to the Catholic Church here. So he was taught growing up that the church is sacred and pure and perhaps more to the point has all of the answers. But by this point in his life, he's watched his hometown die and his parents die, and he feels that the church and its death rituals had nothing valuable to offer in this grief. So for him, the image of falling angels maybe captures his loss of faith in the church. 2 years later, he'll sing, "You could say I lost my belief in the Holy Church" in the song "If I Ever Lose My Faith in You." So his faith in the church is collapsing in the midst of mourning his parents. In verse 2 of When the Angels Fall, he says, "Take your father's cross gently from the wall, the shadow still remaining. See the churches fall in mighty arcs of sound and all that they're containing. Yet all the ragged souls of all the ragged men, looking for their lost homes, shuffle to the ruins from the leveled plain to search among the tombstones. Again, more imagery of ragged souls being stuck somehow. You know, just about every religious tradition, including most indigenous spiritualities, have some kind of sense that when someone dies, their soul needs some sort of help from the living to be liberated or to get to the next place. Obviously, in the Catholic tradition, you have the idea of praying for souls in purgatory, or think of Day of the Dead, which blends Catholic and South American indigenous ideas together. You could point to the Kaddish prayer in Judaism, or the Janazah prayer in Islam, or the Tibetan Book of the Dead in Buddhism, or ghost festivals in Taoism, or the Shraddha in Hinduism, and so on. There seems to be a deep, almost universal instinct to develop some sort of ritualized sending off for the dead. And I think part of what Sting is dealing with here is like, what do I do as a mourner to help the trapped souls of my community and my family? And what happens when your religion doesn't give you what you need right when you need it in that difficult time? So we also have this imagery of taking the cross from the wall. Did he maybe actually do this when his father died? Or does this just represent sort of the end of whatever Catholic faith barely still existed in his family? And now Sting is officially rejecting that. And yet, as the next lyric says, the shadow of the cross still remains. At the climax of this song, we have this lyric that is presumably still being directed at the Catholic Church, and it's, "You can't control us, you can't control us anymore." And then the album ends with him repeating "When the Angels Fall," which then fades into a brief, upbeat, hopeful moment, perhaps suggesting the beginning of some liberation and healing by the end of the album. Another interpretive idea is that the character in the song seems to go from a passive, dreamlike state, if you analyze the first couple verses, and he transitions into taking control of his sense of reality by the end. So maybe it's that after a whole album of struggle with death and loss, Sting is almost taking control of his own sense of meaning now, rather than relying on the church to answer all of his existential questions about life and death. You know, All This Time ends with Sting saying, "Men go crazy in congregations, they only get better one by one." You don't get the sense that Sting is all better by the end of this album, but you do get the sense that he has steered himself into the storm, as it were, and is confronting not only death head on, but all of the other unresolved family and community traumas that are contributing to his suffering. And yes, one of the things that he has to confront is his disillusionment with his Catholic upbringing and the fact that when he needed solace the most, the church's death rituals had nothing to offer him. So what exactly was his issue with the church and its rituals? Well, that's what the song All This Time is really about. And I argue that Sting's problem with the church centers around our sense of connection to nature and the cycles of life and death. What does he mean by "all this time the river flowed endlessly to the sea"? And then in the third verse, after the priests read the Sermon on the Mount at the funeral, why does he ask, "What good is a used up world and how could it be worth having?" Well, we'll talk about those questions in the next video as we do a deep dive on All This Time and pull all of these Soul Cages themes together. Like I said, have a listen to the whole album after watching this and before watching the next one, and let me know what you think in the comments. My name is Mike, you're watching Neon Gods. Subscribe and join the community as we move through our first series, Sting, Religion, and the Meaning of Life. Good night.